Hey guys, welcome back for our lesson on vSphere networking. In this lesson, we're going to spend some time reviewing how virtual networking works in vSphere. We're going to cover a few objectives: configuring vSphere virtual networks, configuring virtual network adapters, and configuring traffic shaping. Let's begin by discussing the concept of a virtual switch in vSphere. Virtual switches in vSphere are similar in many ways to those used by other hypervisor platforms, such as Hyper-V. Virtual switches are used to create virtual networks just as physical switches are used to create physical networks. The important difference is the fact that virtual switches are created via software and they exist only within the virtualized environment. There is no physical hardware or cables involved. The entire network infrastructure is virtualized. In the diagram you see here, a standard vSphere vSwitch is depicted. Notice that a vSwitch is composed of several different parts, and you need to be familiar with each one. Let's begin by discussing the concept of a port group. In a vSphere vSwitch, a port group is a collection of virtual ports on the virtual switch that are configured for a particular function, which is basically the same way a port group works on a physical switch with real cables. You connect the virtual ports on the vSwitch to other virtual devices. For example, you can connect the virtual NIC in a virtual machine to a virtual port within a port group on the vSwitch. In this example, there are 3 port groups. These are default port groups assigned to a vSwitch when it's created: management network, VM network, and physical adapters. You aren't limited to these default port groups. You can define your own port groups on an existing vSwitch. For example, you could define a new port group and assign it to a specific VLAN number. All the VMs connected to that port group would then be members of the same VLAN. On a vSphere vSwitch, there are actually several different types of ports. Standard ports are used to connect the virtual switch to the virtual NICs configured on your virtual machines. Here you see that the VM network port group has 3 ports connected to 3 VMs: FS2, FS3, and VCSA-1. Here's a tip. Green ports are connected to a VM that's powered on. White ports are connected, but the VM is powered off. VM kernel ports are special ports that are dedicated to just management traffic. Whenever you use the vSphere web client to manage an ESXi hypervisor, you communicate with that host through a VM kernel port. VM kernel ports are also used for virtual SAN traffic as well as clustered traffic. In this example, there's one VM kernel port within the management network port group connected to the ESXi hypervisor host. If you don't have a VM kernel port configured, then you will not be able to communicate with and manage the ESXi hypervisor host over the network. vSphere defines several different types of network interfaces for different types of devices that connect to the vSwitch. VM NICs represent the physical network interfaces installed in the hypervisor host. Sometimes you will see these interfaces referenced as PNICs for physical NICs. Each physical NIC is assigned to a unique designation. The first physical NIC is identified as VMNIC 0, then the second as VMNIC 1, and so on. As you can see here, this hypervisor only has one physical NIC, and it's labeled as VMNIC 0. In this example, VMNIC 0 also serves as an uplink connection to the physical network. Whenever a virtual machine on the VM network over here needs to communicate with an external host, the data is going to follow the line shown here through the vSwitch to VMNIC 0 and out onto the physical network, and vice versa. VNICs represent the virtual network interfaces configured on each virtual machine. A given virtual machine may have one or more VNICs configured. Be aware that whenever you install an ESXi hypervisor host, one standard vSwitch named vSwitch 0 is automatically created, and you can use it to get your virtual machines up and running. However, you are not limited to just one vSwitch per host. You can define many vSwitches on the same hypervisor host, each with their own unique configurations. For example, you may want to define a sandbox network using a vSwitch that is not connected to a VMNIC to create an isolated environment where new applications can be tested or malware infections can be resolved without impacting the production network. Up to this point in the course, we've been discussing standard vSphere vSwitches. Be aware that there are actually 2 different types of vSwitches that you can create. A standard vSwitch is defined within the ESXi hypervisor configuration. Therefore, only VMs running on that same host can connect to that vSwitch. Virtual machines running on other ESXi hypervisors can't connect to it. Therefore, using standard switches requires you to create multiple vSwitches throughout your virtualization deployment, at least one on each hypervisor. A distributed vSwitch, or VD switch, is different. Instead of being defined at the host level as a standard vSwitch is, a VD switch is defined at the data center level. This means that one VD switch can encompass multiple ESXi hypervisors, allowing all the VMs running on those hypervisors to be connected to the same VD switch. A graphical representation of what this configuration looks like is shown here. The key advantage of a VD switch is the fact that it makes administration of the virtual network much easier. Instead of configuring and managing multiple standard vSwitches separately, you can make a configuration change just once to a VD switch and have that change applied to all the virtual machines connected to it, regardless of which ESXi host they're running on. This ensures all of your configuration settings and policies are consistent across all of your hypervisors. Admittedly, configuring a VD switch is a little more complex than configuring a standard vSwitch. However, once a VD switch has been defined, it functions in the same manner as a standard vSwitch. In fact, most of the components are similar or even the same. For example, a VD switch uses DV port groups and DV ports, which function in the same manner as port groups and ports on a standard vSwitch. You connect virtual machines to these ports in exactly the same way as you would a standard vSwitch. That's the end of this lesson. In this lesson, we reviewed how virtual networking works on a vSphere. We discussed how vSwitches work, the components that comprise a vSwitch, and how distributed vSwitches work.